You want to know where Jackson Walker is? Emily's voice didn't shake. It should have. Three men with dead eyes and cracked knuckles were standing between her and the door, and the last customer had stopped breathing loud enough to hear. Here, I'll tell you exactly where he is. She set the bar rag down slowly. He's the kind of man who finds out about nights like this one. Cole Grayson smiled like he'd already won. I hadn't learned yet that smiling at Emily Carter was the last mistake a man made before everything went wrong. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The bar was called the Hollow Pine, and on most Friday nights, it smelled like wood smoke, cheap beer, and the particular exhaustion of working people who had earned the right to sit down. It wasn't a fancy place. The stools were mismatched. The jukebox skipped on track 7. The neon Coors sign in the window had been flickering since September, and Jackson Walker kept saying he'd fix it when he had a free afternoon, which in Silver Creek, Montana, meant it would flicker until it died on its own terms. Emily Carter liked it that way. She liked things that kept going even when they were damaged. She was 28 years old, and she had been working behind that bar for 4 years, long enough to know every regular by their drink and their mood, and the particular way they set their jaw when something at home wasn't right. She knew which men needed to talk and which ones needed quiet. She knew when to pour a little heavy and when to cut somebody off before they became a problem. She was good at reading a room. Her mother used to say Emily came out of the womb reading the temperature of whatever space she entered. Her mother had been gone for 3 years now. Cancer. Quick and brutal, the way cancer sometimes is when it decides it doesn't want to drag things out. After that, it was Emily and her younger brother Danny, who was 22 and working construction, when there was construction, to work and sitting in their small rented house off Route 9 when there wasn't. Danny wasn't lazy. He just hadn't found his footing yet. Emily was patient about it. She'd had to become patient about a lot of things. The Friday night in question started the way most Friday nights started. Emily came in at 5, tied her apron, checked the float in the register, and started prepping the garnish tray, even though Jackson always told her they didn't really do garnishes at the Hollow Pine, and she always ignored him. She liked having things in order. She liked the ritual of it. Jackson himself had been in earlier that afternoon fixing a hinge on the back door that had been giving them trouble. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a beard that had gone mostly gray and hands that looked like they'd been carved out of something harder than wood. He was 54 years old, and he moved like someone who had learned a long time ago not to rush. He owned the bar outright, paid his staff fairly, and kept out of people's business in the careful way that people keep out of business they know more about than they're letting on. "You good for tonight?" he'd asked her before he left. "Always," she said. "Call me if anything feels off." She'd smiled at that. Jackson said it every time he left, like a small prayer repeated out of habit. She always told him she would, and she always handled whatever came up on her own, because that was who she was, and he knew it, and he said it anyway, because that was who he was. He left around 4:30. By 9 o'clock, the Hollow Pine had a comfortable crowd. Not packed. Silver Creek wasn't the kind of town that packed anywhere on a Friday anymore. Not since the mill had cut its workforce 3 years back, but comfortable. There were maybe 16, 17 people. The Delacroix brothers at their usual corner table, retired railroad men in their 60s who came every Friday like clockwork. Margaret Olson nursing a white wine and reading a paperback she kept tucking into her purse when anyone looked at her like she was embarrassed to be seen reading at a bar, which Emily found endearing. A group of younger guys from the construction site over on Paulson Road, a little loud but harmless. Pete Waller behind the pool table playing against himself because his usual opponent had moved to Billings. Emily was working the room the way she always did, carrying drinks, keeping track of who needed a refill, who was getting close to their limit, who just needed somebody to make eye contact with them, and nod so they felt like a person and not just a body on a stool. She didn't notice the truck at first. She heard it, though. Big engine, running rough, the kind of sound that carries through a building's walls when everything else goes quiet for a second. But bars were full of cars coming and going, and she didn't think anything of it until the door opened and the cold came in with 3 men who weren't from Silver Creek. She knew that immediately. It wasn't the way they looked exactly, though there was something about all 3 of them, a particular flatness behind the eyes, a way of scanning a room that wasn't curious but calculating. It was the way they moved through the space. People who came to the Hollow Pine to drink moved toward the bar or toward a table. These three men moved to a position. They spread out without seeming to putting themselves between the door and the rest of the room, and the one in front, the tallest one, early 40s with a jaw like a cinder block and a scar that pulled at the left corner of his mouth into something that looked like a permanent half-smirk. He made his way to the bar without hurry and without looking at anything except Emily. She had the sudden clear sensation of being assessed. Not looked at, assessed. "Bar's open," she said because it was the neutral thing to say, and neutral was where she wanted to start until she understood what she was dealing with. "I can see that." He put both hands on the bar flat like he was steadying himself, or like he was letting her see that his hands were empty, though somehow the gesture communicated neither. "You, Emily Carter." The use of her name hit her like a small, cold shock. She didn't let it show. "Depends on who's asking," she said. He smiled with just his mouth. "My name's Cole Grayson. I need to talk to Jackson Walker." "Jackson's not here tonight." "I know he's not here. That's why I'm talking to you." Behind her, she heard the subtle shift of the room. The Delacroix brothers had gone quiet. The construction crew had stopped their conversation. Pete Waller had set down his cue. The whole bar had that hell breath quality that happens when something changes in a room and everyone feels it before they understand it. "I can take a message," Emily said. Cole Grayson reached into his jacket pocket and set a folded piece of paper on the bar between them. "That's not a message. That's a number. Jackson's going to call that number by Monday morning, or there's going to be a conversation that's a lot less friendly than this one." Emily didn't touch the paper. She looked at it, and she looked back at him. "What's this about?" "It's about Jackson making a decision about where his loyalties are. There are some people he owes something to, and those people are getting impatient." "Jackson doesn't owe anybody anything," Emily said. "Not that I know of." Cole Grayson's jaw shifted. "You don't know everything, sweetheart." The word landed the way he meant it, to small and dismissive, designed to remind her of her place. She felt a flare of heat behind her sternum. She kept her voice level. "I know enough," she said, "and I know that Jackson runs a clean business, and he's a good man, and whatever you think you're owed, you've got the wrong idea about the situation." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked around the bar. His two men had drifted closer without appearing to move. One of them was now leaning against the wall near the Delacroix brothers, and the other had positioned himself between the construction crew and the door. "Everybody hear that?" Cole said, raising his voice just enough. "Emily Carter thinks Jackson Walker is a good man." He said it like the punchline to a joke everyone else was supposed to already know. "Tell me something, Emily. What do you actually know about the man who signs your checks?" "I know he's not here, and I know this conversation is over," she said. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The sound that came out of Cole Grayson then wasn't quite a laugh. It was the sound a man makes when he's deciding whether to be amused or angry and hasn't landed yet. "You're asking me to leave." "That's right. You behind a bar with a tip jar and a bar rag are asking me to leave. I'm not going to say it twice." He looked at her for another beat. Then he reached out and picked up the paper he'd set on the bar and held it in front of her face. "Jackson calls that number Monday. Or we come back and we have a very different conversation, and it's not going to be just me asking questions." He set the paper back down and tapped it with one finger. "Put this somewhere safe." He turned to go. His men began to shift back toward the door. Emily looked down at the paper. She thought about Jackson's hands on that back door hinge, the careful, methodical way he worked on things that needed fixing. She thought about what Cole Grayson had said. What do you actually know about the man who signs your checks, and the way he'd said it like he was holding a card he hadn't played yet? She should have let them walk out. She picked up the paper and she tore it in half. The sound was small in that quiet bar, but it carried. Cole Grayson stopped walking. He turned around slowly and looked at the two pieces of paper on the bar. He looked at Emily. His expression went through something, surprise first, then something colder. "You want to think about what you just did," he said. "I already thought about it," Emily said. "This bar isn't a message service for people who walk in here trying to threaten a good man. And if whoever you're working for has a problem with Jackson Walker, they can walk through that door themselves and say it to his face." The room had gone so quiet she could hear the flicker of the Coors sign. Cole Grayson walked back to the bar. He didn't hurry. He put his hands flat on the surface again, And this time he leaned in close enough that she could see the small scar under his left eye that she'd missed before. "Let me explain something to you," he said, and his voice was low now, private meant only for her. "I'm giving you a chance right now because you're standing behind Jackson Walker's bar and you probably think that means something. It doesn't mean what you think it means. The people I work for, they don't need Jackson to pick up a phone. They have other ways of getting what they want. And when they use those other ways, everyone around the person they're looking for tends to have a very bad time." He let that sit. "So you're going to give me Jackson's home address, and you're going to tell me what days he comes in and what time, and you're going to be very cooperative because that's how you make sure tonight stays simple." Emily looked at him. She thought about the people in the room behind her. The Delacroix brothers, 63 and 67 years old, who had never once in their lives deserved to be frightened in their Friday night bar. She thought about Margaret Olson's paperback. She thought about Pete Waller, who had lost his best friend to Billings and came here to feel less alone. She thought about Danny at home, probably watching television, probably eating cereal because he forgot to grocery shop again. She thought about all of it in about half a second. "I'm not giving you anything," she said. Cole Grayson straightened up. He looked over his shoulder at his man near the Delacroix brothers, and that man reached down and picked up Tom Delacroix's beer glass and held it in one hand, just held it, just let the weight and the implication of it sit there in the air. "Wrong answer," Cole said. Tom Delacroix was 63 years old, and he had worked 31 years on the railroad, and he had 2 grandchildren and a bad knee, and he was sitting in his regular seat on his regular Friday, and he was looking at the man holding his beer glass with an expression that wasn't fear. It was something older than fear, something that looked more like grief. The grief of a man who has worked his whole life right and still ends up in a moment like this. Emily put her hand on the bar. "Put the glass down," she said. The man holding the glass looked at Cole. Cole made a small motion with his hand. The man dropped the glass. It shattered on the floor beside Tom Delacroix's stool, and Tom flinched hard, and his brother Gary reached out and grabbed his arm. And in that moment, something crystallized inside Emily Carter that had been forming since Cole Grayson walked through the door. She had been afraid. She knew that. She was still afraid. Her hands were steadier than they should have been, and she understood that was adrenaline doing the work her courage needed it to do, and she was grateful for it. But underneath the fear was something that had been sitting in her chest since her mother died, and Danny struggled, and Silver Creek contracted, and the mill cut its workers, and all the people she loved quietly absorbed one blow after another without complaint because complaint felt useless. She was done with quiet absorption. She reached under the bar and picked up the landline phone, old corded, sitting there since Jackson had put it in before cell service became reliable in the mountains, and she set it on the counter in front of Cole Grayson. "You want to call Jackson," she said. "Call him yourself. The number's on the board by the register. But I'm telling you right now, if you or either of your men puts hands on anyone in this bar, I'm calling the sheriff and I'm giving him a description of your truck and your plates and your faces, and I am a very good witness." She paused. "And then I'll call Jackson." Cole looked at the phone. He looked at Emily. Something moved through his face that wasn't quite uncertainty, but was close to its neighbor. "You've got a lot of nerve for a bartender," he said. "Waitress," she said. "I'm a waitress, and this is the last polite conversation we're going to have." The standoff lasted 8 seconds. She counted them. Each one felt like it had weight and mass, like she could feel them stacking up around her. Then Cole Grayson reached into his jacket pocket. Emily's whole body went rigid. He pulled out a cell phone. He took a photo of her face straight on, deliberate, and he put the phone away. "In case Jackson forgets what's at stake," he said. He walked to the door. His men fell in behind him. At the threshold, Cole stopped and looked back one last time. "Monday," he said, "one way or another." The door closed behind them. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the hollow pine moved or spoke. Then Gary Delacroix exhaled like he'd been holding it since September, and Pete Waller set his pool cue against the wall very carefully, and Margaret Olson closed her paperback and just sat there holding it in both hands. Emily picked up the broom from behind the bar without being asked and walked around to sweep up the broken glass beside Tom's stool. Tom watched her do it. "You okay?" she asked him quietly. "I should be asking you that," he said. "I'm fine," she said. And she was. Or she was close enough to find that the difference didn't matter yet. But she was thinking about Cole Grayson's question. What do you actually know about the man who signs your checks? She swept the glass into the dustpan and thought about Jackson Walker, Jackson who fixed hinges and remembered every regular's order and told her to call him if anything felt off. Jackson, who had never in 4 years raised his voice or treated her as anything less than someone worth listening to. Jackson, who sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, stood at the back window and looked out at the road that ran through the mountains, like he was remembering something he hadn't told anyone. She didn't know what Cole Grayson thought he knew about Jackson. She didn't know what debt or history or complication had sent three men with flat eyes into her bar on a Friday night. But she knew this, whatever it was, Jackson would need to know about it. She picked up a corded phone and dialed his cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She left a message that was short and factual. Three men asked for his address, left when she refused, said Monday, and she hung up and went back to work because there were still people in the bar who needed tending, and she was not the kind of person who stopped tending. The rest of the night was quiet. The Delacroix brothers stayed until last call, which was later than usual. Like staying was itself a form of stubbornness. Pete Waller played another 2 games of pool against himself. Margaret Olson finished her paperback and tucked it into her purse. Nobody talked about what had happened, but nobody was the same after it either. At 11:45, Emily started the close down. She wiped the bar and put the chairs on the tables and did the register count and checked the back door. The hinge Jackson had fixed solid now, the way things became solid when the right person paid attention to them. At 12:15, she locked up and walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. The cold was serious by then, the Montana kind that comes off the mountains with intention. She could see her breath. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jackson. "Got your message. Don't worry, I'll handle it." "Are you all right?" She typed back. "I'm fine." "Who are these people?" Jackson 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. The pause before his answer was long enough that she understood it was not a simple answer. "Old business," he finally wrote. "I'll explain everything. Come in tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. And Emily, you did the right thing tonight." She stared at those words. Old business. In Silver Creek, Montana, on a cold Friday night, Emily Carter drove home through the empty streets and tried to figure out what kind of old business sent men like Cole Grayson to take photographs of a waitress. She didn't sleep well. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought about Tom Delacroix's face when that glass hit the floor. She thought about the way Cole had said everyone around the person they're looking for tends to have a very bad time. She thought about the photo he'd taken of her face. Around 2 in the morning, she got up and made tea and sat at the kitchen table in the dark house and came to a decision that had probably been forming all night. Whatever Jackson Walker's old business was, whatever history Cole Grayson was trying to collect on it had come to Silver Creek now. It had come into the bar where Tom and Gary Delacroix spent their Friday nights. It had taken a photograph of Emily Carter's face. That meant it wasn't old anymore. Whatever it was now. Danny shuffled into the kitchen at 2:30, blinking hair, going in 4 directions. He was wearing a flannel shirt over his boxers, and he looked about 16 years old, which he hadn't been for 6 years. "Why are you up?" he said. "Couldn't sleep." He got himself a glass of water and sat across from her and looked at her with the particular attention he brought out. Sometimes the attention that reminded her of their mother. Something happened at work. She wrapped her hands around her mug. "Yeah," she said, "but I'm handling it." He watched her for a moment. "You want to tell me?" "Not tonight," and she said, "Tonight I just want to sit here." So they sat. Danny drank his water, and Emily drank her tea, and the house was quiet around them in the way of houses where people have held each other through hard things, and outside the Montana cold pressed against the windows. And somewhere across town, the hollow pine stood locked and dark with a new hinge on his back door and a jukebox that skipped on track 7 and a tip jar behind the bar and broken glass somewhere in the alley where Emily had tossed the dustpan's worth of a dropped beer glass. She would go in at 10 and Jackson would explain his old business. And whatever it was, she had already decided she wasn't going to be afraid of it. The fear was still there. It would probably be there for a while, but she'd stood in that bar for 4 years, and before that she'd stood in a hospital room while her mother died, and before that she'd stood in a school cafeteria and defended a girl she barely knew from 3 other girls who thought cruelty was a form of power. Emily Carter had been standing in hard places her whole life. One more wasn't going to break her. Outside, the wind came down off the mountains and moved through the empty streets of Silver Creek like it was looking for something, and the neon Coors sign in the Hollow Pines window flickered once in the dark and kept going the way damaged things do when they're built to last. Jackson Walker was already at the bar when Emily arrived at 10 o'clock Saturday morning. He was sitting at the far end of the counter with 2 mugs of coffee and his hands wrapped around one of them, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept either. She hung her coat on the hook by the door and sat across from him and picked up the second mug without asking whose it was. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Not the way Cole Grayson had looked at her, not assessing, not calculating, just looking. The way someone looks at a person they've been trying to figure out how to be honest with for longer than they should have waited. "Cole Grayson works for a man named Dwight Sauer," Jackson said. "Dwight runs a collection operation out of Kalispell. He loans money to small businesses at rates that aren't legal, and then he collects using methods that aren't either. He's been working Silver Creek for about 18 months. Emily set her mug down. "Working at how?" "Reaching out to owners. The dry cleaner on 4th. The diner over on Route 9. The hardware store that shut down last spring. You remember that Pete Callahan had that place for 22 years. Jackson's jaw tightened. It didn't close because Pete wanted to retire. She felt something cold move through her. "How many businesses?" "That I know about 7, probably more I don't. And nobody called the sheriff." "Dwight is careful. He doesn't put anything in writing. The intimidation is all implicit broken equipment, a delivered package that turns out to be something that could put you in a very bad position if the police showed up. He gives people just enough deniability that they convince themselves it's not worth reporting, and just enough threat that they're sure they can't." Jackson exhaled. "People are scared, Emily. They've got families. They've got mortgages. And Dwight knows exactly how to read that. But he came after your Q-Shatter," she said, "or he sent Cole to come after you, so either you owe him money, which I don't believe, or there's something else." Jackson looked at his hands. "There's something else." She waited. "About 2 months ago," he said slowly, "a woman named Rosa Medina came to see me. She runs the alteration shop on Clement Street. You know her." Emily nodded. "Small woman, precise and quiet. She came in for coffee sometimes on weekday afternoons, always sat at the bar, always tipped 20% on a $3 cup. Rosa's husband had taken a loan from Dwight's people 18 months ago," Jackson said. "Business was slow, they needed to make payroll, and someone came to him with a number that seemed manageable. By the time Rosa figured out what kind of loan it actually was, the interest had doubled what they owed, and Dwight's collectors were coming around the shop every week." He paused. "Her husband had a heart attack in November. Stress-related, the doctor said. He survived. But Rosa was alone with the debt and a sick husband and 2 kids in school, and she came to me because she'd heard from someone I don't know who that I was the kind of person who could help." "Could you—" "I knew people," Jackson said carefully. "People from a different time in my life. People with a particular kind of reach." He looked at her directly. "I made some calls, Emily, and Dwight Sauer found out that I made those calls, and that's why Cole Grayson came here last night. Because Dwight wants to know who I'm connected to and whether he needs to be worried." Emily was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car went by on the main road. Normal Saturday morning Silver Creek people running errands, buying groceries, living their lives in the small, ordinary ways that felt possible when nothing had yet come to threaten them. "What kind of people from a different time in your life?" she asked. Jackson took a long drink of coffee. "You know what the patch on the back of a vest means to certain people?" She felt the question land somewhere beneath her sternum. "Jackson." "I was a long time ago," he said. 22 years. I walked away from it because I wanted something different. I wanted this." He gestured vaguely at the bar, the walls, the mismatched stools. "But you don't entirely walk away. The people, the relationships, they don't disappear. They just go quiet." Emily looked at him. She thought about every Friday night she'd worked in this bar, every conversation, every time Jackson had sat down with a worried regular and just listened. She thought about Rosa Medina's precise and quiet way of sitting at the bar. She thought about Pete Callahan's hardware store. "So when you called your old contacts," she said, "you were trying to help Rosa." "I was trying to find out if there was a way to make Dwight understand that Silver Creek wasn't the right town for his operation," Jackson said, "without anyone getting hurt. And instead, Dwight sent Cole here to take my picture." Jackson's hands tightened around his mug. The knuckles went pale. That was the only sign of what was moving through him, but Emily read it clearly. Yes, he said, and I'm sorry for that. That should never have touched you. It already touched Tom Delacroix, she said. It already touched every person in this bar last night. That glass didn't break in a vacuum, Jackson. It broke in front of people who come here every week because they feel safe here. He nodded. He didn't try to minimize it or explain it away, which was one of the things she had always respected about him. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to call Dwight directly, he said. Try to resolve this before it gets further. And if he doesn't want to resolve it, Jackson looked at her with an expression that was honest in a way that was uncomfortable. Then I'm going to have to make some decisions about how far I'm willing to go to protect this town. She picked up her mug and finished her coffee and set it down and stood up. She untied her apron from the hook and put it on and tucked a pen behind her ear. Okay, she said, okay. You said you'd handle it. I believe you. She moved around behind the bar and started prepping for the day. But Jackson, no more managing information around me. Whatever's happening, I work here. This bar is part of my life, and these people are part of my life, and I'm not a liability. You need to protect from the truth. Are we clear? He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face settled like a decision made. We're clear, he said. The Saturday crowd was thin the way Silver Creek Saturdays were getting. Emily worked the room and kept one part of her mind on the conversation she'd just had, turning it over, examining it from different angles. Jackson had made calls. Jackson had people. Jackson had walked away from something 22 years ago, and the shadow of it had followed him here, and now it was in her bar. She kept her face neutral and her movements steady because the room could read her, and she didn't want to give anyone a reason to worry. At noon, Rosa Medina walked in. Emily had been expecting her in the way you expect things you haven't consciously predicted, but your body already knows are coming. Rosa was 51, with dark hair pulled back tight and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and hands that were always slightly ink-stained from the marking pens she used at the shop. She sat at the bar and looked at Emily and said nothing for a moment. You know why I'm here, Rosa said finally. I have an idea, Emily said. They went to my shop this morning. Rosa's voice was even the way voices go when the emotion underneath is too large for the surface to hold without cracking. Cole Grayson's man, the one who doesn't talk, just looks at things. He came in and he looked at everything in my shop, and he picked up a dress that was in for alterations, a woman's dress, a customer's dress, and he held it up and looked at it, and then he set it back down and walked out. She paused. He didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Emily put a glass of water in front of her. He wanted you to know he could come back, Emily said. I wanted me to know he could do whatever he chose, and there was nothing I could do about it. Rosa wrapped both hands around the glass. Emily, when they first came to my husband before he got sick, when this all started, I told him we should go to the sheriff. He said we couldn't. He was afraid. I thought he was being a coward, and I told him so. Her jaw worked. I've spent 18 months understanding why he made that choice. I'm not proud of that understanding, but I have it. What do you want, Rosa? I want to know what Jackson is going to do, she said, because he told me he was going to help, and I trusted that. And now they're in my shop handling my customers' things, and I need to know whether I made the right call trusting him. Emily leaned forward on the bar. Jackson is handling it, she said, and I am telling you as someone who was standing 3 feet from Cole Grayson last night, you made the right call. Rosa looked at her. You're sure? I am, Emily said, and she was. She didn't know exactly what handling it meant or what shape it would take, but she was sure about Jackson in the way you become sure about someone over 4 years of watching them be exactly who they say they are. Rosa nodded slowly. She drank her water. She thanked Emily and left. At 1:15, Pete Callahan came in. Pete Callahan was 67 years old, and he had the particular deflation of a man who had lost something that was the center of his life and hadn't found another center. He'd been coming to the Hollow Pine since his hardware store closed not every day, but often enough. He always ordered a Coke, never alcohol, which Emily had always noticed, and he always sat at the bar and talked about nothing in particular and left a $5 tip on a $2 drink. He sat down and looked at Emily and said, I heard about last night. Silver Creek was a small town. Of course he had. Who'd you hear from? She asked. Gary Delacroix called me this morning. He wrapped his hands around his Coke the way Rosa had wrapped her hands around her water glass, like the act of holding something solid helped. Said you stood up to Cole Grayson. I asked him to leave my bar, Emily said. That's not standing up to anything. That's basic. No, Pete said, it is not basic. I had the same man in my store 14 months ago. He sat across from me in my office and explained very calmly what would happen to my business and my family if I didn't cooperate. And I listened to him and I wrote him a check, and 2 months later, I wrote him another one, and 4 months after that, my store was gone. His voice didn't break, but it was close to breaking, and the proximity of it was harder to listen to than breaking would have been. I was ashamed of myself. I still am. But I had a wife and I had grandkids, and I was afraid. Emily looked at him straight. Pete, you did what you had to do at the time. That's not the same as doing something wrong. It felt wrong. I know. She refilled his Coke even though he hadn't finished it. But you're here now, and Jackson is handling this. And if there comes a moment when your voice matters, when you telling your story to someone who can do something with it, would help, would you be willing to do that? I was quiet for a long time. The jukebox played something low and country, and the afternoon settled around them. Yeah, Pete said finally, I think I would. She tucked that away. By 3 o'clock, Jackson had come back from wherever he'd gone after their morning conversation, and his face told her that the call to Dwight Sauer had not gone the way he'd hoped. He didn't say that directly. He said, we need to have a conversation tonight after close. There are some people I want you to meet. What people? Old friends, he said. People I trust. She studied his face. How old are we talking? Old enough, he said, and then before she could press it, Emily, I need you to trust me on the timing. Can you do that? She considered it. She weighed what she knew about Jackson against what she didn't know, and the balance came out where it always came out with him. Tonight after close, she said. He nodded and went into his office and closed the door, and she went back to work. The Saturday afternoon passed the way afternoons pass when something is building underneath them, slowly on the surface and faster in ways you couldn't quite measure. She kept moving. She kept her hands busy. She checked on regulars and took orders and made change and smiled at people who needed smiling at. And underneath all of it, she was thinking about Rosa Medina's hands around a water glass and Pete Callahan's voice almost breaking and Tom Delacroix flinching at a dropped beer glass on his regular Friday night. Cole Grayson had come into this bar with 3 men and a photograph and a Monday deadline and thought he was dealing with a frightened waitress and a small-town bar owner who could be leaned on. He had made a mistake. Emily didn't know exactly yet what shape that mistake would take, but she had spent her whole life in rooms where someone bigger and louder assumed they already knew the outcome, and she had learned that the outcome was never decided by who was bigger and louder. It was decided by who refused to leave the room. She was still in the room. At 6 o'clock, friend Carla showed up for her shift. They overlapped on Saturday evenings, and Carla took one look at Emily and said, "What happened to you?" It wasn't a question. "Long day," Emily said. "You look like someone who decided something," Carla said. Carla had a gift for that kind of precision. She was 34 and had worked bars since she was 21, and she read people the way Emily read rooms. "Maybe I did," Emily said. "Good or bad, necessary," Emily said. Carla studied her for another moment and then pulled her apron on and got to work, and they moved around each other in the efficient choreography of two people who know each other's rhythms, and the Saturday evening crowd came in, and the noise level rose, and the Hollow Pine did what it always did, which was hold people. At 8:30, Cole Grayson's second man came in alone. Not Cole, the quiet one, the one who had gone to Rosa's shop, the one who had held Tom Delacroix's beer glass. He sat at the far end of the bar and ordered a beer and didn't look at Emily directly, which was itself a kind of looking. She served him without comment. She kept her hand steady. She felt Carla clock him from across the bar and felt Carla's energy shift into a particular alertness. He sat for 40 minutes. He drank half his beer. He watched the room. Emily watched him watch the room. At 9:10, he put a 20 on the bar, overpaid by $12, no request for change, the way you paid when you didn't want to have a transaction long enough for someone to look at you clearly, and he got up and left. Emily took the 20 and put it in the register and stood at the bar for a moment, breathing through her nose. Carla appeared beside her. "Who was that?" "Someone making sure I'm still here," Emily said. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" Emily thought about it. She thought about what Jackson had said about people convincing themselves it wasn't worth reporting. She thought about the particular weight of information that sits on you alone versus information that is shared. Yes, she said, but not tonight. Tonight I need you to do something for me. Name it. When you close up, don't walk to your car alone. Go with Mike. Mike was the cook, solid and reliable, and 6'3". And if anyone you don't recognize comes in and asks you anything about Jackson or about me, you don't know anything. Can you do that? Carla looked at her for a full 5 seconds. Emily, what did you get into? I didn't get into anything, Emily said. Something came to find me. There's a difference. She reached over and squeezed Carla's arm. Jackson is handling it. I just need one more night. Carla held her gaze and then nodded once the tight, decisive nod of someone who trusts beyond the point where trust is comfortable. One more night, Carla said. The evening built and peaked and began to thin out the way Saturday evenings do, and by 11:30 the last regulars were settling their tabs. Emily moved through the close down with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times, wiping surfaces, stacking chairs, running the register count, checking locks. At 12:10, with the hollow pine empty and Carla and Mike gone into the parking lot together, Emily sat at the bar and waited. Jackson came out of his office at 12:15. He'd changed his shirt, which she noticed because Jackson never changed his shirt midday. He was wearing something darker. He sat across from her and folded his hands on the bar. I need to tell you something before they get here, he said. Then tell me. When I left the club 22 years ago, I left on good terms, he said. Not every chapter, not every man, but the people who mattered, they understood. I'd done my time, I'd stood for what it stood for, and when I decided I wanted a different life, the men I respected that. He paused. But you don't stop being someone's brother. That's not how it works. You step back, you step away. But if something real comes up, something that crosses a line that matters, the phone call still gets answered. Who did you call? Emily asked. A man named Garrett, Jackson said. He's the president of a chapter out of Western Montana. We rode together for 11 years. He's the one who taught me the thing I've tried to live by every day since I left. What thing? Jackson looked at her steadily. That real power isn't about how many people fear you. It's about how many people feel safe because you're there. The words settled over Emily like something she had known without knowing she knew it. He's coming here, she said. He and some of his people, yes. Jackson's voice was quiet but certain. When I explained the situation, not just what happened to you, but what's been happening to this town for 18 months. Rosa's husband, Pete Callahan, the dry cleaner, all of it, Garrett didn't hesitate. He said the same thing he always said when something like this came up in the old days. What did he say? He said, that's not how you treat people. Jackson's jaw worked. 3 words. That's the whole code right there. That's everything. Emily sat with that. Outside, the Montana night was still and cold, and somewhere down the main road she heard faint but unmistakable, the low rolling sound of engines. Not one. Not too many. Jackson heard it too. He didn't move. He just looked at the door with an expression that was complicated in ways that 22 years of distance hadn't entirely resolved. They're early, he said quietly. Is that a problem? No, he said. It means they push through without stopping. He looked at her. Emily, whatever you see tonight, whatever you hear, you need to know that these are good men. They're not what people assume when they hear the name. They have their own code and their own way, and it's not always going to match up with the rule book. But in the things that matter, loyalty, protection, not letting the wrong people do what Cole Grayson's been doing to this town, they're the straightest people I've ever known. The engine sound grew. It moved through the walls of the building, now not threatening, just present a vibration that was also somehow a statement. I trust you, Emily said, and she meant it the way she'd meant it that morning, which was without conditions. Jackson nodded. He got up and walked to the door and put his hand on it. He stood there for a moment before opening it, and Emily watched him and thought she understood something she hadn't before, the weight of stepping back from a life you lived fully and what it cost you and what it meant to have that life come back to you, not with judgment, but with loyalty. He opened the door. The cold poured in, and with it, the unmistakable convergence of engines, shutting down one by one, each silence a punctuation, until the last one went quiet and the night held. Jackson stepped outside. Emily stayed behind the bar. She could hear voices low brief, the clipped exchange of men who don't need many words. She heard Jackson say something she couldn't make out. She heard another voice answer. She thought about Rosa Medina's hands, Pete Callahan's almost break, Tom Delacroix's flinch. She thought about Cole Grayson's photograph. She thought about Danny at home, probably asleep by now, unaware of any of it, and she thought about how the whole point of standing in a hard place was so that the people behind you didn't have to. Then the door opened wide and Jackson came back in, and behind him came a man who had to duck slightly to clear the frame, and behind that man came others in the hollow pine, which had been quiet and close and smelling of wood smoke and wiped down bar, became something else entirely. Not dangerous, not threatening, something older than that, something that felt against every rational expectation Emily had about what this moment was supposed to feel like arrival. The kind of arrival that means the thing you've been carrying alone is finally going to be carried by more than one set of hands. The man who had ducked through the door looked at Jackson first and then at Emily, and what he said was simple and direct and delivered with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had never once confused action with performance. "Tell me everything," Garrett said, "from the beginning." Emily looked at Jackson. Jackson looked at her and gave the smallest nod. She pulled out a stool, sat down, and started talking. Garrett's full name was Garrett Briggs, and he was 58 years old, and he had the kind of face that had earned every line on it. Not handsome in any conventional way, but the kind of face you remembered, broad and weathered, with eyes that were a pale gray blue, and moved the way experienced eyes move, taking in everything without appearing to take in anything. He sat at the bar with his jacket on and his hands flat on the surface, and he listened to Emily the way she'd watched Jackson listen to worried regulars, which was without interruption and without the particular performance of listening that most people substituted for the actual thing. She told him everything. She told it in order, without editorializing, the way she'd learned to give information to people who needed to act on it. Cole Grayson's entrance, the demand for Jackson's address, Tom Delacroix's glass, the photograph, the morning conversation with Jackson, Rosa Medina's hands around a water glass, Pete Callahan's voice, the quiet man who had sat at her bar for 40 minutes drinking half a beer and watching. When she finished, Garrett was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then he said, "How many businesses did you say?" "7 that Jackson knows about, probably more." Garrett looked at Jackson. 18 months. "Approximately," Jackson said, "and nobody went to law enforcement." "Dwight Sauer is careful," Jackson said. "Nothing in writing, everything implicit. He gives people enough deniability that they convince themselves reporting won't work, and enough threat that they're sure trying will make things worse." Garrett nodded slowly, the nod of someone confirming what he already knew from different circumstances in different places. "How many of his people does he run locally?" "Cole's the face, the quiet one. His name is Wade Pruitt. He did 3 years in Deer Lodge for aggravated assault, and at least 2 more I've identified who handle the physical side of collections. There may be additional people I haven't seen." This was new information, and Emily registered it. Jackson had done more homework than their morning conversation had revealed. She filed that away, not with resentment, but with understanding. He'd been trying to get ahead of it before she had to know all of it. She still wished he'd told her sooner, but she understood the instinct. One of the men who'd come in with Garrett had positioned himself quietly near the door, not blocking it, just near it. His name was Dutch, and he was built like someone had assembled him from spare parts intended for a much larger project. He hadn't said anything since they had arrived, and Emily got the sense this was not unusual. There were 6 of them total plus Garrett. They ranged in age from somewhere in the mid-30s to somewhere past 60. They had taken seats in different parts of the bar, with the natural practice spread of people who were accustomed to being aware of a room. None of them were loud. None of them were performing anything. They were simply present in the way that certain people are present, which is to say you felt them even when you weren't looking at them. "I need to make some calls," Garrett said. "I want to know who Dwight Sauer actually is before we do anything." He looked at Jackson. "You said you talked to him directly today." "This afternoon," Jackson said. "He was cordial, told me that the situation was simple. He had an arrangement with certain business owners in Silver Creek, and he expected that arrangement to be respected, and that my calls to you and whoever else I'd reached out to were noted and unwelcome." Jackson paused, and then he said something interesting. "What?" "He said that Silver Creek was a quiet town and he'd like it to stay that way. And that quiet town stayed quiet when people like me remembered that they were bar owners now and not something else. Garrett's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still. He knows who you were. He knows enough, Jackson said. Enough to think it would scare me. Enough to think that reminding me of it would make me back off rather than forward. Did he say anything about Emily? Jackson's jaw tightened. He mentioned that his people had been thorough in their assessment of my operation, and that thorough included knowing who I relied on. Emily felt the implication of that land in the room. She felt Garrett feel it. She felt the 6 men around the bar feel it without any visible change in their posture. Okay, Garrett said. He said it quietly and it landed quietly, but it had a quality of finality to it, like a door being closed, not in anger, but in decision. He looked at Emily directly. You're going to be all right. I want you to know that. I know I'm, Emily said. That's not what I'm worried about. He looked at her for a moment longer. What are you worried about? The people in this town who have already been absorbing this for 18 months and don't know that tonight anything changed, she said. Rosa Medina, Pete Callahan, Tom and Gary Delacroix, the dry cleaner on 4th whose name I don't even know, but who's probably lying awake right now, the same way he's lain awake every night for a year and a half. She kept her eyes on Garrett. I need whatever you do to mean something for them, and not just for this bar, not just for Jackson's old business, for them. Garrett held her gaze. He was a man who had clearly been looked at directly by many people in his life, and he received it without discomfort. That's the plan, he said. She nodded. She believed him. He pushed back from the bar and pulled out his phone and walked toward the back of the room, and the quiet business of whatever came next began. Jackson came around behind the bar and stood beside Emily, and for a moment they were both just standing there, not needing to say anything. The hollow pine held them the way it had held people for years, steadily, without judgment, absorbing whatever was brought to it. You okay? He asked. The same question she'd asked Tom Delacroix on Friday night. Same answer I gave Tom, she said. He almost smiled. I should have told you more sooner. Yes, I was trying to keep it from becoming your problem. Jackson. She turned to look at him. It became my problem when Cole Grayson learned my name. Keeping me in the dark after that point just made me less able to protect myself and the people around me. She said it without heat, just as fact. Promise me, whatever comes next, you tell me. I promise, he said. And with Jackson, a promise was the kind of thing you could put weight on. Garrett's calls took 40 minutes. Emily made coffee, real coffee, not the end-of-night dregs, and passed it around without being asked. And the men took it with the small, courteous nods of people who noticed the gesture and valued it. Dutch, the one near the door, looked at her when she handed him a mug and said, "Thank you, ma'am," in a voice that was much gentler than the rest of him suggested. And she thought about how people were always both things, the thing they looked like and the thing underneath. At 1:45 in the morning, Garrett came back to the bar. Dwight Sauer, he said, setting his phone down, is not from Kalispell originally. He ran a similar operation in Wyoming for about 6 years before law enforcement in Casper got enough on him that he relocated. He's careful because he's had practice being careful. He's never been charged with anything because he keeps himself one layer removed from everything. Garrett's voice was even. But here's the thing about people who are careful for a long time. They get confident, and confident people make different kinds of mistakes than scared people make. What kind of mistakes has he made? Jackson asked. He has a man named Terry Bosch who actually does the paperwork. Loan documents, collection records, the actual written trail of what he's been doing to these businesses. Terry keeps these records because Dwight is paranoid about people skimming from him, and he needs documentation of what each business owes and when they paid and what happens when they don't. Garrett folded his hands on the bar. Terry Bosch is not a loyal soldier. Terry Bosch is an accountant who made a bad career choice and has been looking for a way out of it for about 8 months. The room shifted. Emily felt it, the change in the atmosphere that happens when information introduces a possibility that wasn't there 30 seconds ago. How do you know that? Jackson asked. Because one of the business owners that Dwight has been running in the Flathead Valley is a man named Ricky Oates, and Ricky Oates happens to be the brother-in-law of a man in my chapter. And Ricky Oates, who is not a complicated person, was told 6 months ago by a very drunk Terry Bosch that if Ricky ever found a way to make the whole operation go away, Terry would hand over everything he had. Emily looked at Garrett. Everything he had, meaning the records. 18 months of records, Garrett said. Names, amounts, dates, threats, documented because Dwight wanted his collectors to file incident reports for his own records. He was that paranoid. Letters that were sent, phone calls logged. He paused. Emily, this isn't just enough to go to the local sheriff. This is federal territory. This is enough to take to an FBI field office in Missoula and hand them a complete organized crime case with documentation. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of what that meant, full of the weight of it, full of Rosa Medina's hands and Pete Callahan's closed store and 18 months of quiet suffering. Emily was the first one to speak. How do we get Terry Bosch to actually do it? Garrett looked at her. Then he looked at Jackson. Then he looked back at her, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration. You're asking the right question, he said. I'm trying to. Terry Bosch needs to believe that the protection he gets from handing over the records is real, Garrett said. He needs to believe that walking away from Dwight's operation is something he can survive. Right now, he doesn't believe that because he's been inside Dwight's world long enough to understand what Dwight does to people who create problems for him. So he needs to see that Dwight has a problem he can't manage, Jackson said. He needs to see that the balance has shifted. Exactly. Emily turned her coffee mug in her hands. She was thinking about something, and she let herself think it through before she spoke it the way she'd learned to do with ideas that felt important. Cole Grayson is coming back Monday, she said. Everyone in the room focused on her. He said Monday, one way or another. She looked at Garrett. What if Monday happened differently than he planned? Garrett was quiet. He's going to come back here expecting a frightened waitress and a bar owner whose decided cooperation is safer than resistance, Emily said. He's going to come back here expecting to collect a result. What if instead of a result, he found out that the situation had changed in a way that required him to go back to Dwight and report a problem? You're talking about using his own visit as a message to Dwight, Garrett said. I'm talking about making sure that when Cole Grayson calls Dwight on Monday night, what he says is that Silver Creek is not the same situation it was on Friday, Emily said. That something changed. That there are people here now that Dwight needs to think very carefully about before he sends anyone else. She paused. Because if Dwight suddenly understands that his operation here has attracted a different kind of attention than he anticipated, then maybe Terry Bosch stops being afraid. And maybe Terry Bosch makes a different decision. The room was quiet. Then one of the men older sitting at the table nearest the window, a man who hadn't spoken yet and whose name Emily didn't know, said, "She's right." And then Dutch from the door said simply, "Yeah." Garrett looked at Jackson. Jackson looked at Emily with an expression that was several things at once and might have been pride if it weren't also more complicated than pride. "Monday," Garrett said. "We'll be here Monday." Emily nodded. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the particular steady clarity of a decision made on solid ground, which was different from bravado and different from recklessness. It was just right. The next right thing in a sequence of right things that started when she tore a piece of paper in half on Friday night. She looked at the clock. It was past 2 a.m. "There are rooms at the Pine View Motel on Route 9, she said. "Tell whoever you need to tell. I'll call ahead and make sure they have space." She looked at Garrett. "Is that enough of you, or are there more coming?" Garrett's mouth curved. It was the first time she'd seen anything on his face that approached a smile. "There are more coming," he said. "They'll be here by Sunday evening." She absorbed that without showing what it meant to her. "I'll make sure there's enough room." She picked up a corded phone from behind the bar, the same phone she'd put in front of Cole Grayson 2 nights ago, and she dialed the Pine View and woke up the night clerk and sorted out the rooms with the brisk efficiency of someone who had always been better at logistics than at waiting. When she hung up, Garrett was watching her. "Jackson said you were the kind of person who handled things," he said. "He told me you were the kind of person who showed up when things needed handling," she said. Garrett nodded. "Fair enough." The men filed out gradually, quietly, the way they'd arrived, without performance, without announcement. Garrett was last. He stopped at the door and had turned back. "Emily." His voice was the same level, unhurried. But there was something in it. What you did Friday night, refusing to give them what they wanted, refusing to be intimidated, that matters. It matters because it gave us a starting point. These situations, when people have been ground down for a long time, they usually end one of 2 ways. Either someone with power forces a resolution, or someone without power decides they've had enough and draws a line. You drew a line. That's what made this possible. He held her gaze for one more moment. Don't forget that part. He stepped out into the cold and the door swung shut behind him. Emily stood behind the bar in the empty hollow pine for a moment alone, for the first time since midnight. She could hear the engines starting outside one by one, moving away toward Route 9. Jackson came out of the back with his coat on. You need a ride home. My car's here. I know your car's here. I'm asking if you want company to it. She appreciated the distinction. Yeah, she said. I do. They walked out together, and the cold hit them both, and the parking lot was empty now, except for their two vehicles. The main road was quiet. Silver Creek on a Sunday morning at 2:30 was as close to silent as a place got, and in that silence, Emily thought she could still feel the residual vibration of all those engines, something that had moved through the still Montana air and hadn't entirely left it. Get some sleep, Jackson said at her car. You too. I'll try. He put his hand briefly on the roof of her car, not on her, not touching her, just near her, the gesture of someone who wanted to offer something they knew wasn't theirs to give. You were remarkable tonight. I was practical, she said. Sometimes those are the same thing. She got in and started the engine and drove home through the empty streets, and when she got there, the house was dark and Danny was asleep, and she changed out of her work clothes and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. She thought about Monday, Cole Grayson in his truck driving toward the hollow pine with the comfortable certainty of a man who expected to arrive and find what he'd left, a scared waitress, an isolated bar owner, a room full of people too frightened to be useful. And instead, what she didn't know the full shape of it yet. That was Garrett's territory, the logistics and the positioning and the things that men who understood power and understood about displaying it correctly. She trusted that. Her job was the bar. Her job was the people. Her job was to be exactly where she'd been on Friday night, behind the counter steady, because steadiness was what the room needed, and she had always been the person who provided what the room needed. She lay down. She didn't expect to sleep, but she did quickly, cleanly, without dreams that she remembered in the morning. Sunday arrived gray and cold and purposeful. Emily opened the bar at noon. She told Carla the short version, not everything but enough. She told her that some of Jackson's old friends were in town, and that Monday was going to be a different kind of day, and that Carla should stay home Monday night. Carla listened and said 3 words, "Are you safe?" And Emily said yes. And Carla said, "Then I trust you," and went back to work. Rosa Medina came in at 1 o'clock. She sat at the bar, and Emily poured her coffee without being asked, and Rosa wrapped her hands around it and said, "Something's different." "Yes," Emily said. "Is it better different or worse different?" Emily looked at her. "Better," she said. "But I need you to do something. I need you to write down everything you remember. Dates, amounts, names, what was said to you, what was said to your husband, what the loan documents said if you still have them. Everything, as much detail as you can." Rosa looked at her steadily. Why? Because someone is going to need it," Emily said. "Someone who can actually do something with it." Something moved through Rosa's face. It started as wariness and moved through uncertainty and landed somewhere that wasn't quite hope, but was hope's immediate neighbor. "You found someone," Rosa said. "We found a path," Emily said carefully, "but it needs everything you have." Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she set down her coffee and picked up her purse and pulled out a small notebook, the kind with a spiral at the top, the kind a woman who ran an alteration shop might use for measurements and notes, and she set it on the bar. "I've been writing it down for 8 months, she said quietly. "Every time they came, every time they called, every time my husband looked at the door and his blood pressure went up. I've been writing it down because I didn't know what else to do with it, and I couldn't just keep it only in my head. It was too heavy." Emily looked at the notebook. She looked at Rosa. She felt something catch in her chest, the sudden sharp awareness of what it meant to carry something alone for 8 months. The loneliness of it, the exhausting private weight of it. "Rosa," she said, "can I hold on to this?" Rosa pushed it across the bar without hesitation. "It's already yours," she said. At 3 in the afternoon, Pete Callahan came in and Emily asked him the same thing she'd asked Rosa, to write down everything he remembered. He said he didn't have a notebook like Rosa's, but he had a memory, like a steel trap, about anything that had happened to his store, because that store was 22 years of his life, and every single day of it was still in him. She gave him a legal pad from Jackson's office, and he sat at the bar for 2 hours and wrote. At 5, the Delacroix brothers came in, which was unusual for a Sunday. They sat in their corner, and Tom Delacroix looked at Emily across the room with the particular look of a man who has processed something and arrived at a decision, and when she went to take their order, he said quietly, "Tell me what you need from us." She told them, same thing, write it down, what they saw Friday night, what they knew about Sauer's operation from around town, who they'd heard from. Gary said he knew the owner of the dry cleaner on 4th Man named Paul Wren, and that Paul had confided in him 3 months ago about pressure he was under. Emily said she'd need Paul Wren's name and she'd need Gary to make a phone call. Gary made the phone call from the bar. Paul Wren picked up on the second ring, and Emily could hear from Gary's side of the conversation the particular relief in Paul's voice when he understood what was being asked of him. Not more silence, not more waiting, but to speak, to be a witness to his own experience. It lasted 12 minutes, and when Gary hung up, he set the phone down and looked at his hands. He cried, Gary said, on the phone for about 30 seconds. Then he stopped and he said, "I have everything. I kept all of it." Emily thought about what Garrett had said the night before. Someone without power decides they've had enough and draws a line. She had drawn a line, and the line had given other people permission to draw their own. By Sunday evening, she had Rose's notebook, Pete's legal pad, Gary's notes from his conversation with Paul Wren, and a list of names that Jackson had compiled: 7 business owners who had been in Dwight Sauer's grip for months, 7 stories, 7 sets of documentation, 7 people who had been alone in this and were no longer alone in it. Jackson laid it all out on the bar and looked at it. "This is enough," he said. "When we add this to what Terry Bosch has, if we can get Terry Bosch to move, this is more than enough. Then let's make sure Monday gives Terry Bosch a reason to move," Emily said. At 8 Sunday evening, Garrett and his men returned. More of them this time. She counted 11 bikes in the lot and a van she hadn't seen before, and the particular organized quietness of people who had been briefed and were ready. Garrett came in and sat at the bar, and Emily spread the documentation in front of him. He went through it methodically, page by page, Rose's careful handwriting and Pete's cramped printing and Gary's notes and the list of names. When he was done, he looked up. "Monday," he said, "when Cole Grayson comes, you're going to be exactly where you were on Friday, behind the bar, doing your job." He held her gaze. "We'll be outside. He won't see us until it's time for him to see us. And when he sees us, what you need to do is nothing. Just be exactly who you are." "That's the easy part," Emily said. Garrett almost smiled again. "For some people it isn't." He stood. "We'll be ready at 9. You said he came at closing last time." "After closing, around 9:30. "We'll be here at 9. The men filed back out. Jackson remained. He sat across from Emily, and they looked at the documentation spread on the bar between them. All those names, all those months, all that weight that people had been carrying alone. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Jackson said, "you know that you changed this. Before you tore that paper, before you stood there and refused, this was an operation that was going to keep running. Because nobody believed that standing up was possible." He looked at her. "You made them believe it." Emily looked at the bar. She looked at the tip jar with its small folded bills. She looked at the jukebox that skipped on track 7. She looked at the flickering Coors sign in the window. "People needed someone to go first," she said. "That's all it was." "That's everything it was," Jackson said. She turned off the lights, and they walked out, and she locked the door and stood in the cold parking lot for a moment and looked up at the Montana sky, which was immense and dark and scattered with more stars than most places got. And she felt the full weight of what Monday was going to be, and she let herself feel it without flinching. Cole Grayson was coming back. And this time, Silver Creek was ready. Monday came in cold and clear, the kind of Montana morning that has no ambiguity in it, the air sharp enough to hurt. If you breathed too fast, the sky a hard, flat blue that offered nothing soft. Emily was at the Hollow Pine by 8:30. She unlocked the door and turned on the lights and started the coffee and did the open-up routine the way she always did it, because routine that held you when everything underneath was moving. She checked the float in the register. She restocked the garnish tray she didn't need. She wiped the bar surface that was already clean. At 8:50, Jackson arrived. He came in through the back door, the one with the fixed hinge, and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed saying that hadn't already been said. "Garrett's people are in position," Jackson said. Where? You don't need to know exactly. What you need to know is that they're there. He came around to the bar side and poured himself coffee. Cole will come in and he'll see you and he'll see me and he'll see a bar that's open for business on a Monday morning, which will seem like nothing has changed. That's what we want him to think in the first 30 seconds. And after 30 seconds, it depends on Cole, Jackson said. If he makes a smart decision, things stay controlled. If he makes a different kind of decision, he paused. Garrett is outside. Emily nodded. She understood what that meant and what it didn't mean. Garrett being outside wasn't a threat held in reserve. It was a fact in the world, like a change in weather, not something you chose to deploy, but something that simply was that altered the entire atmosphere of the situation, whether Cole Grayson knew about it yet or not. Are you scared? Jackson asked. She considered the question honestly. I'm focused, she said. Scared is in there somewhere, but it's not running things. He nodded. That's about as good as it gets. The bar opened at 9 and two regular Monday morning customers came in, older men retired, who used the bar the way some people used a diner, a place to be somewhere for an hour with coffee. Emily served them and talked with them about nothing in particular and watched the clock and kept her breathing steady. At 9:40, Jackson's phone buzzed on the bar. He looked at it and said, "Truck just turned onto Main." Emily took one breath, set down the coffee pot, straightened her apron. The two regulars had no idea what was coming. She thought briefly about asking them to leave and decided against it. Cole needed to walk into a normal-looking bar, and two men with their Monday morning coffee was normal. She'd get them clear before anything escalated if it came to that. The door opened at 9:44. Cole Grayson came in alone. That was the first thing she noticed. He was alone. No Wade Pruitt, no second man. Just Cole in the same jacket he'd worn Friday with the same jaw and the same half smirk that his scar built for him, whether he intended it or not. He stopped just inside the door and looked around the bar. His eyes moved over the two regulars past Jackson and landed on Emily. He took a moment to organize whatever he'd expected to see against what he was actually seeing, and whatever he concluded from that, he walked to the bar with the comfortable stride of a man who was still certain he held every relevant card. "Morning," and he said. "Morning," Emily said. "Nice day." He looked at Jackson. "Walker." "Cole," Jackson said. The Cole put his hands on the bar, the same gesture, flat, palm deliberate. He looked at Emily. "So, you had the weekend to think. I'm hoping we're going to have a shorter conversation than last time." "Probably not," Emily said. He tilted his head. Something shifted in his expression, but he kept it managed. "See, I don't understand why you want to make this difficult. You seem like a smart woman. Smart people make calculations. The calculation here is simple." "Tell me your calculation," Emily said. "I want to hear you say it." He looked at her with something that might have been mild surprise that she'd asked rather than flinched. "My calculation is that Dwight Sauer has been running a business in this town for a year and a half, and that business is not going away because a waitress decided to be brave on a Friday night. My calculation is that Jackson Walker has made some calls to some old friends, which Dwight is aware of, and which Dwight is not particularly concerned about, because the people Jackson called are smart enough to know that walking into this particular situation is bad for everyone." He kept his voice level and almost friendly, the tone of a man explaining a bill that's already overdue. "So my calculation is that this morning you give me Jackson's home address, you confirm the days and times he's reliably here alone, and we all go about our business." Emily looked at him. She thought about Rosa Medina's notebook. 8 months of careful handwriting. She thought about Pete Callahan writing for 2 hours on a legal pad, his whole story in his memory, because it had been 22 years of his life. She thought about Paul Wren crying on the phone for 30 seconds and then stopping and saying, "I have everything. I kept all of it." "Cole," she said, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "How long have you been working for Dwight Sauer?" He blinked. It was a small movement, but she caught it, the micro-adjustment of someone who didn't expect that particular question. "What does that have to do with anything?" "I'm curious," she said. 4 years, 5 long enough, that you've been part of what he's been doing to people in this town, and in Casper, Wyoming before that, and wherever he was before Wyoming." She watched his face. "Long enough that when whatever is coming for Dwight's operation actually arrives, there's going to be documentation that includes your name on it." Cole's jaw stopped moving. It went still in a way that was more significant than anything he'd said. "Documentation," he repeated. 18 months of it, Emily said. "From 7 business owners in Silver Creek alone. Loan documents, logged calls, written incident reports that Dwight made his collectors file for his own records, which turns out to be an interesting choice having everything written down. And that's before we get to what the accounting records show. She kept her voice calm. Terry Bosch says hello, by the way. The blood left Cole Grayson's face in a visible wave. It happened fast. 1 second he was managing the room, and the next second the room had turned into something completely different, and every instinct he had was reorganizing against the new information. You don't know Terry Bosch, he said, but it came out wrong. It came out with the uncertainty of a question wearing the clothes of a statement. I know enough, Emily said. The same way you knew enough about Jackson on Friday. Funny how that works. Cole looked at Jackson. Jackson looked back at him with an expression that was perfectly still. Who did you talk to? Cole said. Not to Emily now, to Jackson. His voice had dropped, and the almost friendly quality was completely gone. Who did you bring into this? Old friends, Jackson said, like I told Dwight I would. Cole's hand came off the bar. He took a step back, and his eyes moved to the door, and then around the room and back to the door. And Emily watched him do the calculation, the real calculation, not the one he'd walked in with. The one that involved what he now understood about where the situation actually stood versus where he'd believed it stood. You need to think very carefully, Cole said, and now his voice had an edge in it that was different from the edge he'd used on Friday. Friday's edge was confidence. This edge was something closer to cornered. Dwight has people you don't know about. This isn't something that goes away because you got documentation or because Jackson made calls. Dwight has been doing this for 15 years. He doesn't stop because one town gets organized. You're right, Emily said. He doesn't stop because one town gets organized. He stops because the FBI field office in Missoula gets a package. She let that land, which is where everything we've collected was sent at 8 o'clock this morning. That was the moment Cole Grayson understood that he had not walked into a bar on a Monday morning. He had walked into the end of something. She watched it move through him, not slowly, but in stages, each one visible. The denial, the rapid internal recalculation, the assessment of options. And then the thing underneath all of it, the thing that had probably been underneath everything for however many years he'd been doing this work, which was a man who had gotten so deep into something he'd forgotten there was an outside to it. You're making a mistake, he said. But there was no authority left in it. No, Emily said. You made a mistake. You walked into this bar on a Friday night and you looked at a waitress and you thought you already knew what she was. Cole didn't answer that. The door opened. Not violently, not dramatically. It just opened the way a door opens when someone pushes through it with the intention of entering a room. Garrett Briggs stepped inside. He was wearing his jacket and his hands were visible, and his face held the same even settled expression it had held at the bar on Saturday night. Behind him came Dutch, and behind Dutch, two more, and they positioned themselves in the room the way they had Sunday night naturally without theatrics, occupying space the way people occupy space when they belong in it. Cole Grayson turned around and saw them and went very still. Garrett looked at Cole. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just let Cole see him clearly, who he was, what he represented, what the patch on the front of his jacket meant to someone like Cole who understood what it meant. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds, and in those 5 seconds, Cole Grayson did more growing up than he'd probably done in years. Son, Garrett said finally. The word wasn't condescending, it was almost gentle. I think you know you're done here. Cole's jaw worked. He looked from Garrett to Jackson to Emily and back to Garrett. He was calculating something, maybe exits, maybe outcomes, maybe the particular arithmetic of how you got from where he was standing to somewhere that wasn't this. Dwight will know about this by noon, Cole said. Dwight's going to know about a lot of things by noon, Garrett said. That's not your problem anymore. Your problem is what decision you make in the next 30 seconds. Cole looked at him. What decision? Whether you walk out of here and drive away from Silver Creek, or whether you stand here and wait for the next conversation, which is going to be with people wearing different kinds of jackets. Garrett's voice was the same throughout, level without threat, in the theatrical sense, just clear. The clarity of someone telling you exactly how things are. You've got people in your life that this doesn't have to touch. Parents maybe, people who didn't sign up for where this is heading. You've still got time to make that separation clean. Cole stood there for 8 seconds. Emily counted them again the way she'd counted the 8 seconds of the standoff on Friday night. And these 8 felt different, Heavier, more final carrying, more consequence in each of them. Then Cole Grayson picked up his keys from where they'd been sitting on the bar and walked past Garrett and past Dutch and past the two others and out the door. The two Monday morning regulars who had been sitting very quietly with their coffee through all of it looked at each other and then at Emily. "Should we?" one of them started. "Stay," Emily said. "Coffee's on the house this morning. You've both earned it." The older of the two, a man named Harold, who had been coming in for 3 years, looked at Jackson and then at Garrett and then at Emily and said, "You want to tell me what just happened?" "Not the whole thing," Emily said, "but the short version is that some things in this town are going to change." Harold looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and raised it slightly a small private toast. "About time," he said. Outside, Cole's truck started. They heard it pull out of the lot and onto the main road and then fade in the direction of the highway. No drama, no confrontation. Just a man leaving a town that had refused to be what he needed it to be. Garrett sat down at the bar. He looked at Emily. 8 o'clock this morning, he said. "You actually sent it." "I said I would," she said. "I thought you might wait until after to see how it went." "The package being sent before he arrived was the point," she said. "If I'd been bluffing about that, he might have felt it. Cole is many things, but he's not stupid. He needed to know it was already done." Garrett looked at Jackson. "Where did you find her?" "She found me," Jackson said. "She walked in 4 years ago and asked if I was hiring, and I said yes, and she's been running this place better than I do ever since." Garrett turned back to Emily. "The FBI contact is that solid?" "It's solid," Jackson said, and Emily looked at him. He met her eyes. "I have a contact in the Missoula field office. Man named Reyes. We've had a relationship for about 6 years. Nothing formal, but he's a man who cares about doing the job right and who has been looking for a way into Dwight Sauer's operation for 2 of those years. I called him Sunday night and told him we had documentation." He paused. "He was on the phone with me for 45 minutes. He asked about Terry Bosch by name." Emily stared at him. "You already knew about Terry Bosch." "I knew about Reyes knowing about Terry Bosch," Jackson said. "What Garrett found out was that Terry was ready to move. That was the piece I didn't have." She absorbed this. There had been layers she hadn't seen moving simultaneously with the layers she'd been inside of. She thought about whether she was bothered by that and decided she wasn't. The outcome was what mattered, and the outcome was that a package was sitting in an FBI field office in Missoula. "When does Reyes move on it?" Garrett asked. "He said to give him 72 hours to get authorization," Jackson said. "He wants to bring it through proper channels so nothing gets contaminated. The documentation we sent is solid, but he needs to build the case correctly, or Dwight's lawyers walk him out the other side." Garrett nodded. "And Dwight knows something happened this morning because Cole is going to call him." "Yes. So we have 72 hours in which Dwight is aware that something changed, but doesn't know exactly what or how bad." "Yes," Jackson said, "which is where Terry Bosch becomes critical. If Dwight panics in the next 72 hours and moves to destroy records, Terry's records specifically, then some of what we sent becomes harder to corroborate." "Terry won't let that happen," Garrett said. "My man talked to Ricky Oates again this morning. Ricky talked to Terry. Terry has copies. 3 separate locations, including one with a person Dwight doesn't know exists." Something that wasn't quite satisfaction moved through Garrett's face. Terry Bosch spent 8 months being too scared to move, and now that the door is open, he's been very thorough about making sure he gets out clean. Emily thought about what it meant to be too scared to move for 8 months. She thought about Rosa's notebook. She thought about Pete's legal pad. She thought about all of them separately and their separate fears, each one not knowing that the others were also keeping records, also not sleeping, also hoping in that small private way that something would change. She thought about what would have happened if she'd given Cole Grayson the number on Friday night. Nothing would have changed. The weight would have just gotten heavier and more distributed, and eventually it would have broken things that didn't need to be broken. At 11 in the morning, Rosa Medina came in. She didn't sit down. She stood at the bar and looked at Emily and said, "I heard Cole Grayson's truck left town." Silver Creek was a small town. Of course she'd heard. "Yes," Emily said. "Is it done?" "Not yet, but the part that needed to happen this morning happened." She held Rosa's gaze. "Your notebook is in the package, Rosa. Your husband's name, your dates, your records. It's all there." Rosa pressed her lips together. She nodded very slowly, the nod of someone who has been holding something for so long that the prospect of putting it down is almost more than they know how to absorb. Her eyes went bright and she blinked it back with the precision of a woman who had decided she would not cry about this until she was alone. Will it be enough? She asked. It's more than enough, Jackson said from behind Emily. Combined with what the other business owners provided and what's coming from Terry Bosch, it's enough to put Dwight Sauer away for a long time. Rosa looked at him. My husband thinks I've lost my mind, she said. He thinks trusting Jackson Walker is naive. Jackson didn't flinch from it. Your husband doesn't know me, he said, but he knows what this has cost his family. That's a reasonable basis for skepticism. I told him what you did for us trying to help when you didn't have to, Rosa said. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said to tell you, thank you. She paused. That's not a small thing coming from him. Jackson nodded. Tell him I understand. Rosa left. Pete Callahan arrived 20 minutes later, and Emily gave him the same update. He sat with it quietly and then said, what happens to the debt, the money Dwight claimed we owed? Part of what Reyes is building, Jackson said. Illegal lending operation. The debts were fraudulent instruments. You're not going to owe Dwight Sauer anything, Pete. Neither will anyone else. Pete put both hands flat on the bar and looked at them. 22 years, he said, not to anyone in particular, just saying it, naming the thing he'd lost and the weight of the distance between what had been and what might have been. Emily put her hand over his briefly. She didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would fit inside that particular grief. Some things you just witnessed. By early afternoon, word had moved through Silver Creek the way word moves in small towns, not through any official channel, not through announcement, but through the organic transmission of people who pay attention, talking to people who pay attention. That something had happened at the Hollow Pine Monday morning. That Cole Grayson's truck had left town. That Jackson Walker's old friends were at the Pineview Motel, and they weren't from around here, but they weren't causing trouble either. That Emily Carter, who everyone knew from behind the bar, had been at the center of something that nobody yet knew the full shape of. The Hollow Pine filled up at a rate that was unusual for a Monday. Not a crowd exactly, but more than a Monday warranted. And Emily understood what it was, people who needed to be somewhere that felt like something was happening, who needed to be near the center of a shift they could feel but couldn't entirely name yet. She served them. She moved through the room. She smiled at people who needed smiling at. She was exactly who she'd been on Friday and Saturday and Sunday, because that was the whole point. At 2:15, Jackson's phone rang. He looked at the screen and his expression changed in a way Emily had learned to read, not alarm, but high attention. He answered it and walked to the back, and she watched him through the pass-through window, watching his posture, the set of his shoulders. He came back 4 minutes later. Reyes, he said quietly. Emily waited. Terry Bosch called the field office directly at noon today, Jackson said. Walked in without an appointment and asked for the organized crime division and handed them a flash drive. He paused. Reyes said it's the most comprehensive documentation of an illegal lending and extortion operation they've received outside of a wire-monitored investigation. Dates, amounts, names, recordings. Terry had been recording conversations on his own phone for 6 months. Emily stared at him. He was recording them. 6 months of Dwight Sauer's operation captured on a personal phone, Jackson said, including conversations with Cole Grayson, including a conversation about Friday night. His jaw tightened, including Dwight telling Cole that if Jackson Walker's name came up again to deal with the woman at the bar directly. The room went very quiet for a moment in Emily's perception, though nothing around her actually changed. Deal with the woman at the bar directly. She heard it. She let herself hear it clearly without minimizing it or rushing past it. She let it be exactly what it was, a threat made against her by a man who had never met her and had no feeling about her whatsoever beyond her usefulness as leverage. Then she let it go, not because it didn't matter, but because it had already failed. It had been a threat, and it had not come to pass, and the man who had made it was now the subject of a federal investigation that included his own words on tape. What's Reyes's timeline now? Garrett said from behind her. She hadn't heard him come back in. He said 36 hours, Jackson said. They're moving faster because of what Terry brought in. They want to move before Dwight figures out what's happening and starts destroying anything Terry might have missed. Garrett nodded. We'll stay through Wednesday, he said, in case anything moves before Reyes is ready to act. You don't have to do that, Jackson said. I know we don't have to, Garrett said. We're going to. Emily looked at Garrett. She thought about what Jackson had told her, that you don't stop being someone's brother. That when something real comes up, the phone call still gets answered. She understood now what that meant in the concrete and specific way, rather than the abstract way she'd understood it before. Thank you, she said to Garrett. He looked at her with the same steady gray-blue eyes and said, you started this. We're just making sure it finishes. The afternoon pushed toward evening, and the Monday crowd at the Hollow Pine stayed longer than Monday crowds usually stayed, and Emily worked through it without hurrying anyone. At some point around 5, she realized that the two Monday morning regulars, Harold and his friend, whose name she'd never learned after 3 years because she'd simply always thought of him as Harold's friend, were still there. Harold was on his 4th coffee, and his friend had switched to decaf, and they were talking to Pete Callahan about the railroad. And Pete was talking back, and the Delacroix brothers had arrived without her noticing when they arrived, and Carla had come in for her shift and was moving through the room with her usual efficiency, and the Hollow Pine was doing the thing it had always done, holding people, being the place where things got absorbed and processed and survived. Emily stood behind the bar for a moment and looked at the room and felt something she was careful not to name too quickly because she didn't want to jinx it, a fragile, cautious thing that might have been the early edge of relief. Not the full thing yet. The full thing was still 36 hours away, and there were still 36 hours of things that could go wrong. But the first right thing had happened, and then the second and the third, and they had stacked up in the careful, deliberate way that right things stacked when people refused to be quiet. She thought about something Jackson had said that morning. Scared is in there somewhere, but it's not running things. It was still in there. She could feel it, the low-level background hum of a fear that wouldn't fully leave until Dwight Sauer's name was in a federal indictment, and the people in this town could lie down at night without calculating what Monday morning might bring. But it wasn't running things. She was running things. From behind a bar in Silver Creek, Montana, with a garnish tray she didn't need, and a jukebox that skipped on track 7, and a tip jar that had coins mixed in with the bills because she'd stopped sorting it out ages ago. At 9 o'clock that night, Jackson found her in the kitchen on her break, and he said, Reyes called again. She turned from the counter, and Dwight Sauer was taken into custody at 6:30 this evening, Jackson said. His home in Kalispell. Federal agents, not local. He paused. Reyes said the 36 hours became 12 because Dwight started making calls after Cole reached him this morning, and 2 of those calls were to people already under separate federal surveillance. He essentially drew a line connecting himself to a larger investigation they have been building for 3 years. Jackson's voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness, she could hear the weight of it, years of knowing this man existed, years of hoping a town like Silver Creek would never have to fully absorb the consequences of that existence. It's done, Emily. She stood in the kitchen and breathed. She thought about Friday night, about the piece of paper she'd torn in half, about the sound it made in the quiet bar, small, almost nothing, a tiny act of refusal that should have been too small to matter against the scale of what was arrayed on the other side of it. She thought about how every large thing was built from small things, and how the small things were the ones that actually required courage because they had no guarantee attached to them. The large things felt significant in the moment, but the small things, the torn paper, the phone call made, the notebook kept, those were the ones that had done it. Those were the load-bearing pieces. Rosa needs to know, she said. I'll call her, Jackson said. And Pete, yes, and Paul Wren and the others. I'll call all of them, Jackson said. Tonight. He looked at her. Emily, go back out there. Let me make these calls and then come back out and be with the people in your bar. That's where you should be right now. She looked at him. She thought about what he'd told her Sunday morning, that he'd tried to build a peaceful life, that he'd walked away from something bigger because he wanted something quieter and more honest. Are you okay? She asked. He seemed surprised by the question. I'm fine. That's not what I asked. I was quiet for a moment. It's complicated, he said finally. I'm glad it's over. I'm glad nobody got hurt. I'm glad Garrett came. I'm glad you, he stopped. He looked at his hands and at her. I spent 22 years trying to make sure that part of my life stayed in the past. And then a woman named Rosa Medina walked in here and needed help, and I made some calls, and it turned out the past was the only thing that had the reach to actually fix this. He paused. I don't know what to do with that yet, but I'm okay. I'm more than okay. She nodded. Make your calls, she said. I'll be out front. She pushed through the kitchen door and stepped back into the warm noise of the hollow pine and went behind her bar and picked up where she'd left off, which was where she always picked up, exactly where she was doing exactly what the room needed. The jukebox played. The Coors sign flickered. Harold and his friends sat with their decaf, and Pete Callahan talked about the railroad, and the Delacroix brothers had their corner, and Carla worked the room with her usual precision, and Emily Carter stood behind the bar in a town that was already, even if it didn't know the full news yet, different from the town. It had been Friday night. The weight had lifted, not just from this bar, from the dry cleaner on 4th, from Rosa Medina's alteration shop, from whatever was left of what Pete Callahan was building toward, now that 22 years of work was no longer buried under an illegal debt. But from the Delacroix brothers' Friday nights and Harold's Monday mornings, and all the ordinary daily life of people who deserve to live it without fear, pressing down on it from above. She didn't feel like a hero. She was clear-eyed enough about herself to know the difference between what she'd done and what the word hero implied. She'd made a decision on a Friday night and kept making decisions after that, and the decisions had accumulated into an outcome. That was all. That was everything. Jackson came back out at 9:45. He looked at her across the bar and gave her a small nod. Calls made people notified, and she gave him one back, and that was enough. At 10:15, her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it, and then she opened it. It was 3 words from an unsaved number that she would later find out belonged to Terry Bosch, forwarded through Ricky Oates, through Gary Delacroix to her, in the relay chain way that information moved through networks of people who trusted each other. "Thank you, we're safe." Emily read it twice. She set the phone face down on the bar and picked up a glass and started polishing it the way she'd polished 1,000 glasses behind this bar over 4 years, and she didn't let her face do anything in particular, because the room was full of people, and the room didn't need her feelings right now. But behind her ribs, something that had been clenched since Friday night finally slowly let go. Part 5, A New Beginning. The news broke officially on Tuesday morning, not through the Silver Creek Gazette, which came out on Thursdays and would scramble to cover it in a special digital edition by Wednesday afternoon. Not through the Sheriff's Department, which had been notified by Reyes's office at 7 a.m. as a professional courtesy, and was still processing what it meant that a federal operation had been running parallel to local law enforcement for 2 years without their knowledge. The news broke the way news broke in small towns, through phone calls and text messages and conversations at gas stations, and the particular velocity of information that moves when an entire community has been holding its breath for 18 months and suddenly has permission to exhale. By 9 o'clock Tuesday morning, Emily had received 11 texts, 3 from people she knew well, 4 from people she knew slightly, and 4 from numbers she didn't recognize at all, which meant the information had already traveled far enough to loop back to her through strangers. The texts all said variations of the same thing. "Is it true? Did this really happen? Are you all right?" She answered each one the same way. Yes, yes, and yes. She was behind the bar when Carla arrived for the morning shift. And Carla walked in, took one look at Emily's face and said, "Tell me everything. The real version, not the version I'm going to hear from Harold." So Emily told her, the full version this time, all of it from the first engine sound on Friday night through the text from Terry Bosch on Monday evening. She told it straight through without stopping, and Carla listened without interrupting, which was not Carla's natural mode, but which she sustained for the full duration. And when Emily finished, Carla was quiet for about 4 seconds and then said, "You tore the paper before you knew any of it was going to work out." "Yes," Emily said. "You did it just because it was right." "I did it because handing it over felt wrong," Emily said. "That's maybe a smaller thing than right." "No," Carla said. "That's exactly what right feels like from the inside. It feels like something you can't do rather than something you should do." She tied her apron with decisive pulls. "I'm making you breakfast. You look like you haven't eaten a real meal since Friday." Emily started to object, and Carla was already in the kitchen, so she didn't bother. At 10:30, Agent Reyes called Jackson directly. Emily was close enough to hear one side of it, Jackson's responses, which were brief and confirmatory, and his face, which told the rest. When he hung up, he turned to her. "Dwight Sauer was arraigned this morning," he said. "Federal charges, 18 counts, including extortion, illegal lending at usurious rates, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Cole Grayson turned himself in at 9 a.m. through a lawyer. Wade Pruitt was picked up at his apartment in Kalispell at 7:30. He paused. And the operation in Wyoming that Dwight ran before he came here, the one that pushed him to relocate Reyes's office, is coordinating with Wyoming federal prosecutors. There are victims there who've been waiting 6 years for this. Emily thought about 6 years. She thought about 18 months. She thought about 8 months of Rosa's careful handwriting and 22 years of Pete Callahan's store and the particular mathematics of time that passed when something wrong was allowed to continue. What about the debts? She said. Reyes confirmed what Jackson said: Sunday illegal instruments unenforceable. He's having his office send letters directly to each business owner this week. Official federal correspondence stating that the amounts claimed by Sauer's operation are null. Jackson looked at her. No one owes anything. She thought about Rosa's husband and his heart attack. She thought about the stress-related qualifier the doctor had used, the clinical distance of it, and what it meant when you translated it back into the human reality of a man lying in a hospital bed because the pressure of an illegal debt had been living in his chest for 18 months. You couldn't give that back. The nullified debt didn't restore what the weight of it had cost, but the weight was gone now, and whatever Rosa's husband could build in its absence, he would build without that particular darkness pressing down on him. Good, Emily said, and then because she needed to do something with her hands, before the feeling in her chest became something she had to manage in front of the bar. I'm going to call Rosa. She stepped into the back and called Rosa's number, and Rosa answered on the first ring, which meant Rosa had been holding her phone since the news started moving. I know, Rosa said before Emily could speak. Jackson called last night, and I couldn't sleep, and then I heard this morning from 3 different people before 7 a.m. Her voice was the voice of someone who had been awake since before there was light. My husband cried this morning. He doesn't cry. He hasn't cried since his mother died. A pause. I didn't tell him that hearing him cry was the best sound I've heard in a year and a half. Emily pressed her free hand against the wall. How does he feel? Like someone put something down, Rosa said. Like someone physically removed something from the room that had been taking up space and consuming oxygen. Her voice caught slightly and then steadied. Emily, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Go ahead. Was it my notebook? Did my records actually matter? Or are you going to tell me it was going to happen anyway because of Terry Bosch and the federal case? Emily thought about Reyes's 72-hour timeline, becoming 36 hours, becoming 12 because Dwight panicked. She thought about what had made Dwight panic. Cole Grayson calling him Monday morning after walking into the Hollow Pine and discovering the situation had changed. The situation changing because of a package sent at 8 a.m. containing Rosa's notebook and Pete's legal pad and 7 sets of documentation from 7 businesses. The package making Reyes move faster than he'd planned because the documentation was comprehensive enough to accelerate his authorization. Your notebook was in that package, Emily said, and the package changed the timeline. If the timeline doesn't change, Dwight has time to destroy things before Reyes has authorization. Without your 8 months of records, we had a weaker case and more time for things to go wrong. She paused. You asking yourself whether you mattered is like asking whether one stone in an arch matters. Take it out and see what happens to the whole structure. Rosa was quiet for a long moment. My husband wants to meet you, she said finally. When he's ready, when this is when it settles a little. Another pause. He's a stubborn man, but he's a fair one. He wants to meet the woman his wife trusted when trusting wasn't easy. I'd like that, Emily said. Tell him to take his time. She hung up and stood in the back for a moment before going out front, giving herself those few seconds of privacy to feel what she was feeling without an audience. The relief was larger than she'd expected, not because she doubted the outcome once Reyes moved, but because relief doesn't scale to your expectations. It scales to how long you've been holding the opposite of it. She'd been holding the opposite of it since Friday night. She went back out to the bar. The Tuesday that followed was unlike any Tuesday the Hollow Pine had ever seen. People came in who didn't usually come in on Tuesdays. People who hadn't been inside since Pete Callahan brought them in years ago. People who had been meaning to stop by, people who had heard what happened and needed to be in the place where it had happened. The Hollow Pine became, in that particular Tuesday, the physical location of something. Silver Creek needed to be near not a crime scene and not a celebration venue, but something in between, something that was just the place where the story had been. Emily worked through it. She poured coffee and pulled beers and made change and smiled at people and talked when talking was needed and was quiet when quiet was needed. And the whole time she was doing it, she was also doing something else. She was feeling the room the way she had always felt, rooms reading it and responding to it and giving it what it needed to keep being itself. At 1 in the afternoon, Pete Callahan came in. He sat at the bar and he ordered a Coke like always, and he left his $5 tip on a $2 drink like always, and then he said something he'd never said before in 3 years of coming here. "I'm going to reopen," he said. Emily looked at him. "The hardware store," he said. "Not in the old building that's leased to someone else now, but there's a space on Merchant Street that's been empty for 8 months. I looked at it 6 months ago and talked myself out of it." He wrapped his hands around his glass. "I talked myself out of it because the debt was still there, and I couldn't see how to start something new while I was still carrying what Dwight had put on me." He looked at her directly. "The debt is gone. I've got savings. I've got 22 years of knowing what people in this town need from a hardware store and what they can't find anywhere else since mine closed." He paused. "I'm 67 years old. Some people would say that's too old to start over." "Some people are wrong," Emily said. He smiled a real smile, the kind she hadn't seen on Pete Callahan's face in the time she'd known him. "That's what I thought," he said. She reached across the bar and shook his hand. He held it for a moment with both of his, the grip of a man who meant something by it, and then let go. At 3 o'clock, Garrett Briggs came in for what turned out to be the last time. His men had been settling their bill at the Pineview since morning. He sat at the bar and Emily poured him coffee without being asked, and he wrapped his hands around it in the way that people who spent time in cold climates learn to hold warm things. "We're heading out this afternoon," he said. "I know," she said. "Jackson told me." "How are you doing with all of it?" She considered the question, the way she always considered questions from people who asked them sincerely. "I keep waiting to feel like it's over," she said. "But it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like something becoming what it was supposed to be." Garrett nodded slowly. "That's the better version," he said. "Endings are overrated. Things becoming what they were supposed to be, that's the one that actually means something." She looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "When Jackson called you, when he explained what was happening here, was there a moment where you thought about not coming?" Garrett held her gaze. He didn't answer immediately, which she'd learned was his way. He didn't answer until he had the honest answer ready. "There's always a moment like that," he said. "When you're my age with the life I've lived, you think about the cost of things. Coming here had costs. Time, resources, the attention of people who don't need our business being their business." He turned his coffee mug slowly. "But then you get past that moment, because Jackson Walker is my brother. Not by blood, by something that matters more than blood, which is choice. He chose to be in a brotherhood, and then he chose to leave it in the right way, and he never once used what that brotherhood was for anything that wasn't right." His voice was even. "And then a woman in Silver Creek, Montana, tore a piece of paper in half on a Friday night, and that was the real reason we came. Because when someone without power decides that fear is not going to run their life, that's worth showing up for." Every time. Emily absorbed that. She thought about the full arc of it, from the sound of engines outside a bar on a Friday night to a federal arraignment on a Tuesday morning, and Garrett Briggs's voice saying the word choice, like it was the only word that mattered. "Thank you," she said, "for coming, for staying, for all of it. Take care of this bar," he said. "Take care of this town. And take care of Jackson. He's been trying to take care of everyone else for so long, he forgets to let anyone do it for him." She smiled. "I know," she said. "I've been working on that for 4 years." Garrett stood up and put a 20 on the bar for a $3 coffee, and when she started to make change, he shook his head. Then he offered his hand and she shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and it said everything that needed to be said. He walked out of the hollow pine. She watched him go. Outside, the engines started one by one and then gathered into the collective sound that she would probably hear in some corner of her memory for the rest of her life, that particular combination of power and discipline and motion. She heard them pull out onto the main road, and she heard them move through Silver Creek, and she heard them reach the edge of town, and then she heard them fading into the distance that Montana offered in abundance. The long, empty distances where sound carried until it didn't. And then they were gone. Jackson came out of his office and stood beside her, and they listened to the quiet that followed. The Hollow Pine held its regular Tuesday afternoon sounds. Harold at the bar, a couple of construction workers in the corner booth, the jukebox cycling through its playlist, skipping slightly on track 7 the way it always did. "You okay?" she asked. Third time she'd asked him that in 4 days. He'd asked her the same. "Yeah," he said, and this time it landed clean without the complicated layers it had carried before. Just yeah, just okay. "I'm going to fix the jukebox this weekend," he said, the skipping on track 7. She looked at him. "Don't," she said. He looked back at her. "I like that it skips," she said. "It's part of the place." He almost laughed, a real sound, the first uncomplicated one she'd heard from him in days. "Okay," he said, "it stays." They stood side by side at the bar in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon, and Silver Creek existed around them, ordinary and specific in theirs, and it was enough, more than enough. The weeks that followed moved in the way that weeks move after a crisis resolves, not quickly back to normal, but forward into something adjacent to normal that had the shape of normal while containing everything that had happened. The federal case against Dwight Sauer built itself through the machinery of the justice system with the patient grinding efficiency of something that had enough evidence and enough will. Reyes called Jackson twice more in the first 2 weeks with updates. Cole Grayson cooperated. Wade Pruitt did not cooperate, which his lawyer would come to regret. Terry Bosch was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony and his recordings in the entirety of 18 months of documented financial crimes, and he relocated to somewhere that was not Montana and was not Wyoming, and that no one at the Hollow Pine needed to know. The letters arrived. Federal correspondence official and precise, addressed to 7 businesses and 7 business owners in Silver Creek, Montana. Rosa Medina received hers on a Thursday morning and called Emily from the shop and read it out loud over the phone, her voice doing the thing it had tried not to do the morning after Dwight's arraignment, and this time she let it. Emily listened and said nothing until Rosa was done reading and done crying, and then said simply, "Keep it somewhere safe." "I'm framing it," Rosa said. "I know that's strange, but I'm framing it." "It's not strange at all," Emily said. Pete Callahan signed a lease on the Merchant Street space 3 weeks after Dwight Sauer's arraignment. He put a sign in the window that said Callahan Hardware coming soon, and spent 2 weeks doing the build-out himself, and on the Saturday it opened, the Hollow Pine had its lowest bar attendance in recent memory because half of Silver Creek was across town at Pete's reopening. Emily closed early and went herself. She bought a set of cabinet hinges she didn't need and a level she already had, and she stood in the clean, bright space of Pete's new store and felt the particular satisfaction of a town taking something back. Pete was behind his counter, helping 3 customers at once, with the easy competence of a man who had never actually forgotten how to do this, who had simply been prevented from doing it. He saw her across the store and raised his hand. She raised hers back. Danny came into the bar on a Wednesday night about 3 weeks after everything. He didn't come in often, not his kind of place, he always said, though Emily suspected he meant he didn't want to drink in the place where his sister worked. But he came in that Wednesday and sat at the bar with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at her. "I heard the whole story," he said. "From who?" "Everybody," he said. "Seriously, Emily, everybody in town. You can't buy gas without someone telling you about what happened here." He looked at the bar, at the tip jar, at the jukebox. Then he looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" She considered how to answer. "Because I was handling it," she said, "and involving you would have meant worrying about you while I was trying to focus." He absorbed that. "That's kind of annoying," he said. "I know. Also kind of—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. He was 22, and he hadn't found his footing yet, and he was still figuring out what kind of man he was going to be. And in that moment, Emily saw their mother in him so clearly it almost stopped her breathing. The same jaw, the same way of going quiet when the feeling was too big for words. "Kind of what?" she said softly. "Like Mom," he said, "the way you just handle things. And don't make a big deal of it. She was like that." He looked up. "I didn't realize how much you were like that until I heard this story from people who weren't you, and they kept saying it the same way every version. That you just stood there, that you didn't run, that you tore up the paper and told him to leave." He paused. "I was proud of you. I wanted to say that out loud because I don't think I say things out loud enough." Emily reached over the bar and put her hand on top of his head. For a second, the way she'd done when he was 12 and she was 18, and the world was a different and simpler weight. He let her. Start saying things out loud, she said. It's a good habit. He stayed for an hour and drank a Coke, and they talked about nothing in particular and everything in general. And when he left, he hugged her across the bar in the slightly awkward way of bar hugs, and she held on for a moment longer than usual, and he let her. 6 weeks after Dwight Sauer's arraignment, the Hollow Pine was the same bar it had always been. The stools were still mismatched. The jukebox still skipped on track 7 because Emily had said leave it and Jackson had left it. The neon chorus sign in the window still flickered because Jackson kept saying he'd fix it when he had a free afternoon. The tip jar still had coins mixed in with the bills, but something had settled into the walls of the place that hadn't been there before or had been there in seed form and was now something fuller. People came in differently, not dramatically, not with any visible change in how they walked through the door or ordered their drinks. But there was something in the way the room held itself, a looseness that had replaced a tightness no one had consciously named until it was gone. Tom Delacroix sat in his corner on a Friday night and laughed at something his brother said, and the laugh was full and unguarded in a way that it hadn't been for 18 months, and Emily heard it from behind the bar and felt it register in her chest like a chord resolving. Rosa Medina came in on a Wednesday afternoon, and her husband came with her. He was a quiet man solidly built with the careful movements of someone still rebuilding his confidence in his own body after a health scare. He sat at a bar beside his wife and looked at Emily for a long moment, and then he said in careful English that carried an accent and a formality that told her this was a rehearsed thing, a thing he'd decided to say exactly this way. My wife trusted you when trust was hard. You did not let her down. I wanted to say that to your face. Emily looked at him. She trusted me because she was brave enough to, she said. That's your wife, not me. He looked at Rosa. Rosa looked at him. Something passed between them that Emily understood was private, was built from years in hardship and survival, and she did not try to read it more specifically than that. She poured them both coffee and moved to the other end of the bar. The federal case moved forward through its processes. Reyes provided updates when he had them, and Jackson relayed them to Emily, and the shape of the case became clearer. Over weeks, the scope of what Dwight Sauer had built, how many towns, how many businesses, how many people who had spent months and years believing they were alone in an impossible situation. Silver Creek was one node in something larger, in the documentation that 7 people in a small Montana town had kept Rosa's notebook, Pete's legal pad, Paul Wren's careful records. All of it became part of a federal case that stretched into 2 states and implicated people nobody in Silver Creek had ever heard of. Reyes called one afternoon and told Jackson that the Silver Creek documentation was, in his exact words, the most coherent and comprehensive victim record he'd seen in a case of this type. That the fact that 7 separate people had independently kept records, and that those records corroborated each other and corroborated Terry Bosch's accounts almost perfectly, had made the prosecutor's job significantly easier. Jackson told Emily this. Emily thought about 8 months of Rosa writing in a spiral notebook because she had to put it somewhere. She thought about the particular human instinct to document wrongdoing, to make it real on paper, to insist on its existence when everything around you was trying to make you pretend it wasn't happening. People knew, she thought, even when they didn't know what to do with what they knew to write it down, to hold on to it, to keep it until someone came along who could use it. She had been that someone, or she had been part of the chain of someone's. And that was enough. That was more than enough. 3 months after the night Cole Grayson first walked through the door of the Hollow Pine on a Friday evening that was cold and clear in the specific way of Montana winter, Emily was behind the bar when the door opened and she looked up out of habit. It was Harold. Harold and his friend, whose name she had finally learned was Vincent because Danny had been here once when Vincent was here, and Danny had introduced himself and then told Emily his name like it was news, which it was. Harold and Vincent arriving at their regular time for their regular Monday coffee on a day that happened to be Friday, because Harold had a doctor's appointment Monday and had asked if they could shift it, and Emily had said, of course, whenever you want. This is your bar too. They sat at the bar, and Emily poured the coffee without being asked, and Harold looked at the room and then at Emily, and said in his direct way that she'd come to appreciate over 3 years, town feels different. Yeah, she said. Better different, he said. Not a question. Better different, she agreed. He picked up his coffee and sipped it, and set it down and looked at her with the particular attention of an older man who has lived enough to recognize things for what they are without needing to make a speech about it. Good, he said, and that was all. She smiled and moved to the other end of the bar, and the Hollow Pine held its Friday night the way it held every night, steadily without drama, with the quiet insistence of a place that had decided what it was and intended to keep being it. Jackson came out of the back at 8 o'clock and leaned against the bar beside her, and they looked at the room together for a moment, the way they had looked at it on Tuesday afternoon after Garrett's engines faded from the distance. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. Tell me. Cole Grayson's question, he said. The one he asked you on Friday night. What do you actually know about the man who signs your checks? He paused. I've been thinking about what the answer actually is. What you actually know about me. Not the version I was afraid of, the old history, the club, the complicated parts. The actual answer. Emily thought about it. 4 years of Fridays. 4 years of Jackson fixing things that needed fixing. 4 years of him saying, call me if anything feels off, and meaning it and being available when she called. 4 years of watching him sit with worried regulars and just listen. 4 years of him treating her like someone worth listening to. I know that you built something honest and you take care of it, she said. I know that when Rosa Medina needed help, you didn't calculate what it would cost you. I know that when Garrett showed up, you let him see you needing backup without being ashamed of it. I know that when I told you to stop managing information around me, you stopped. She looked at him. I know that the person you are right now is the full version of you, not a retirement from something bigger, the full version. Jackson was quiet for a moment. That's a good answer, he said. I know, she said. I've had 4 years to develop it. He almost smiled. Then he actually smiled, the same real uncomplicated smile she'd heard from Pete Callahan the day he said he was reopening the store. The kind of smile that arrived when the weight had actually been set down rather than just shifted. Emily Carter stood behind the bar in the Hollow Pine on a Friday night in Silver Creek, Montana, and the room was what it had always been. The Delacroix brothers in their corner, Pete Waller at the pool table now, playing against a man from the construction crew who'd started coming in regularly. Harold and Vincent with their coffee, Carla working the room with her usual precision, the jukebox cycling through its playlist. Track 7 came up. It skipped. She looked at it and smiled to herself and turned back to the bar. She thought about Friday nights, about the particular quality of them in a place like this, the way they accumulated week after week into something that wasn't just time passing, but life being lived. She thought about all the people who had sat on these mismatched stools and absorbed hard things and come back the next Friday, because coming back was the thing they knew how to do. She thought about what a bar actually was. Underneath the business of it, not a place to drink, but a place to be somewhere. A place to not be alone with whatever you were carrying. She had been the person behind the bar for 4 years. She would be the person behind the bar next year and the year after that. And for as many years as she chose, and she understood now in a way she hadn't fully understood before Friday night what that meant. What it cost and what it gave back. It meant that when the room needed someone to hold it, she was there. It meant that when fear came through the door and tried to make itself at home, she was the one who said no. It meant that when people needed someone to go first, she was available to go first. She had always been available. She hadn't always known what for. Now she knew. Outside Silver Creek went about its Friday night in the particular ordinary way of a town that had come through something and was still here, still itself, still choosing to be itself, still showing up in the small daily acts that were the actual fabric of a community. Pete Callahan was probably still at his store doing inventory, finding reasons to stay later than he needed to, because the store was new and he still couldn't quite believe he had it back. Rosa Medina was probably at home with her husband, and her husband's heart was probably beating at a rate the doctor would approve of, and whatever they were talking about was probably not Dwight Sauer. Paul Wren was probably behind the counter of his dry cleaner's shop, doing whatever closing time tasks dry cleaners did, and doing them without the particular dread that had attended every closing time for a year and a half. All of that was happening because a woman had refused to hand over a piece of paper. And because she'd refused, something had broken open. And what had come through the break was not chaos, but people. People who'd been waiting for permission to stop being silent, who'd been keeping their own records and their own accounts of their own suffering, who needed only someone to go first. She had gone first. And because she had, Silver Creek was a different town than it had been on a Thursday. Not a perfect town, not a town without struggle or hardship or the ordinary weight of ordinary life, but a town where the people who lived in it knew something about themselves now that they hadn't known before, that they were not alone in the hard things, and that the hard things could be faced, and that facing them together was not only possible, but was the thing that made a collection of buildings and strangers into an actual community. Emily Carter was 28 years old and she worked behind a bar, and she was raising her younger brother, and she did not call herself a hero, and she would not have accepted the word if you'd offered it to her. She was a waitress. She was good at reading rooms. She was her mother's daughter, which meant she handled things and didn't make a big deal of it, and came back the next Friday. She came back every Friday. That was the whole story. That was the only story that mattered. A waitress stood her ground in a small town bar, and Silver Creek learned that silence only ever protects the people causing harm, and that one person willing to be the first to refuse can set an entire town free.